Hello, my name is Paul Marchbanks, and this is Digging in the Dirt, with the second entry in a series entitled Life is Layered. Today I'll be talking about the sensuous surface of life. In the model I'm proposing of a multi-layered existence, no layer is far more important than the others. They are all interpenetrating one another. They work together in concert. And if we were to privilege one layer at the expense of all the others, we would be doing ourselves great harm. We'd be shooting ourselves in the foot. So even though I'm going to talk about the drawbacks of focusing on the sensuous world today, I don't want to suggest that it is far less important than the others. The point is going to be that if we focus on any particular layer and ignore the others or sideline the others, then we are going to have to deal in the future with some pretty serious drawbacks, some pretty serious consequences. Let's consider human suffering. There are so many different ways to respond to pain. Look at a few religious figures like the Buddha, who says life is suffering. This is a close cousin to Stoicism. What we need to do is recognize that we are going to suffer and move through that suffering, right? There's a film came out starring Liam Neeson a few years ago entitled The Gray, in which he plays this character, this world-weary character named Otway, who has a very bleak view of existence, perhaps in part because of some personal things he's been going through, which are only hinted at in the film. But he likes to recall a poem that was pasted on the wall of his abusive home. He had an abusive father, which reads, "Once more into the fray, into the last good fight I'll ever know. Live and die on this day. Live and die on this day." The suggestion is that life is suffering and that you need to move through it into more suffering, and that life is terminal. It will end. It's bounded, so it doesn't go on forever. You can take some measure of hope in that. Life is born in violence and pain, and it ends the same way. And this is most definitely true in this film. Spoilers. There's also another way of looking at suffering. Jesus, another religious instructor, teaches us that we are going to have trouble in this world. But he says that he has overcome the world. There's the suggestion that we need to move through pain towards hope. So a slightly different perspective than what the Buddha provides. And there are so many other ways of responding to pain, of engaging with pain or retreating from it. One of those is to turn from it and run, right? To retreat from it altogether. In one of my favorite dystopic novels, we have a character named Perdita who has fallen in love with this very charismatic, beautiful guy named Raymond, and they've had a child together, and all has been hunky-dory for a number of years. But at the moment, which I'm going to share with you, she has just discovered that he may well be cheating on her. And she wishes the very intense negative emotions that she's experiencing could be eliminated, could be cut off. And she imagines what it might be like if she could retreat into nature. She looks at a pot of flowers and thinks this: "Divine infoliations of the spirit of beauty, ye droop not, neither do ye mourn. The despair that clasps my heart has not spread contagion over you. Why am I not a partner of your insensibility, a sharer in your calm?" She imagines being able to become one with plants so that she could escape the travails of this world. That's one response to struggle. Another that we've seen playing out on the international stage in the last 2 centuries is to struggle, to take the horns of what's trying to gore us and push back. Now, with all the different revolutions, from the American Revolution to the French Revolution, and then to the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century, and lots of revolutions in between, we have seen those who have been suffering the the slings and arrows of injustice, of inequality, struggling to find a voice, to gain some basic human rights, and to have a forum in which they can express themselves, in which they can tell their stories, and in which their rights are going to be heard, fair court systems, and federal governments that actually do not reify some kind of hierarchy that privileges the wealthy elite over the working class. So there has been this struggle, a halting struggle. Sometimes it feels like it's 2 steps back for every step forward, but a struggle that nevertheless, which has continued to try to reach some kind of egalitarian world. Unfortunately, sometimes our rhetoric outstrips our progress. There is another response to pain and suffering, which is very popular, and that's to, at the same time that we're experiencing pain, to try to distract ourselves with pleasure, to double down in our pursuit of pleasure. And it can look like a kind of hedonism, but I get it. I totally get it. I may not be a glutton who overeats or an alcoholic or a drug addict, but I get the desire to overcome pain with pleasure. When I was younger, I put a lot of emotional investment into dreaming of what it might be like to have the ideal in-home viewing environment in which I could watch movies and just retreat from exhaustion and stress and anxiety, right? I imagined a leather couch that just kind of enfolded me, that I could just disappear into, that comforted me almost, right? So that's the sense of touch. And then I imagined an immersive sound system with a rumbling bass and very clear higher frequencies that would tantalize my ears. And of course, in addition to the wonderful sound system, you've got to have our gargantuan screen in front of you, where with the aid of a pause button, you can take in every single detail of every single shot, should you wish to. And all of this, of course, would be complemented by wonderful food that I could ingest. So now I am stoking my desire for gustatory sensations, I'm satisfying my palate and my sense of olfaction, so that all my senses are somehow engaged in this viewing experience. I get it. I totally get the desire for pleasure. And for me, watching films can sometimes hit all my buttons simultaneously, even though I don't quite have the in-home film experience that I had longed for many years. I can achieve something that's relatively close to it. But there are other forms of pursuing pleasure that can be very, very detrimental. If I had been longing for this particular viewing experience and not considering the impact on me of what I watch, the content, or considering the community in which I took in such a film and the relationships that I might build, then I could very well have ended up like the anti-hero of Orson Welles' film from 1941, Citizen Kane, one of the most famous films of the 20th century, where we have a very wealthy character who has in-home theaters and long hallways and everything he could want in terms of material success, and yet is very, very alone. I'd like to juxtapose against this more grand and spectacular vision of failure that we get with Citizen Kane, where he has put so much into personal pleasure, the portrait of John Keats. He's a British poet from the Romantic period, so this is the late 18th, early 19th century, and a poster boy for a lot of romantic values from that period. Much of what I'm going to say is going to be considered heresy, I'm sure, by many of my peers who adore Keats. His values have had an outsized influence on poetry and literary thought in the 2 centuries since he wrote much of what I'm going to share with you. But I think that in many ways, his ideas are just as problematic as more extraordinary hedonistic pursuit of pleasure like we find with the drug addict or Citizen Kane. So, that is John Keats, experienced a lot of pain. He lost his uncle to tuberculosis, what we were then calling consumption, his mom to the same disease, his brother, Tom, and then he saw his own early death as a result of TB. In 1815, he decided, perhaps in part because of his mother's death, to study medicine. So he signed up at Guy's Hospital in October of that year for a 6-month course of study. Within a year, he was advanced to becoming a dresser, someone who could actually dress wounds, set bones, work with injuries. So he saw plenty of physical and emotional suffering as a physician, and took an exam so that he could practice just in time to begin caring for his brother Tom, who had contracted the disease. And over the course of the following 2 years, through 1818, John tended to his brother. This is probably what gave him the disease. So he's surrounded by people who are dropping off because of tuberculosis and has to stare down the barrel of his own imminent demise because of this disease as well. So we get from him a lot of different strategies for responding to suffering. One of these sounds like what we received, what we were given in Mary Shelley's The Last Man from Perdita. In one of John Keats' most famous poems, Ode to a Nightingale, he envisions what it might be like to withdraw into the woods with a nightingale and to escape human suffering. This was written soon after the death of his brother. That I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim, fade far away, dissolve, and yet quite forget what thou amongst the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret here, where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad, last gray hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre-thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow, and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. So these lines register a few of his concerns: the desire to fade away into nature, the observation that thought itself is sometimes very, very heavy and can lead to depression, and the idea that beauty is ephemeral, that it does not last. He developed this idea in a letter written to a friend earlier than this, to Benjamin Bailey. This was in November 22nd of 1817, where he writes, "Oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thoughts." Now, this is a thesis which he develops in a number of poems. One of my favorites is To Autumn, and I have to say, I have a beautiful portrait of autumn's colors outside my office window. There aren't many places on the Central Coast where you confront trees that are changing color in fall, but I am blessed with a few trees right outside my door that are currently in a state of dark green through dark red, in every hue between those. It's gorgeous. And in this poem, To Autumn, you get a sense of how beautiful and autumn is, but also how it activates all your senses, right? You can almost taste what he's describing. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, etc. He's speaking to autumn, personifying it, and thanking it for all the ways in which it is pushing his buttons, right? So I think we can enjoy this and not be too troubled by a celebration of autumn. Keats turns in the poem Ode on Melancholy to the threat of depression, which he dealt with himself. And he suggests in this poem that perhaps we should move through our depression and take some measure of joy in the darkness of it, and respond in what I think is a rather curious way to the anxiety and sorrow of a lover. He writes in Ode on Melancholy, this is stanza 2, But when the melancholy fit shall fall sudden from heaven, like a weeping cloud, that fosters the droop-headed flowers all, and hides the green hill in an April shroud, then glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or on the rainbow of the salt sand-wave, or on the wealth of globed peonies, or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand, and let her rave, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die. Everything wonderful dissipates and fades away, and Keats is always reminding us of the ephemerality of pleasure. Here, he imagines that his lover's beauty is going to fade, and so, in a way, he decides to tackle that ephemeral beauty and to feed on it. Now, I'm actually rather troubled by his suggestion that in the midst of his lover's complaining about something, which probably involves his own behavior, she let her rave and feed on her eyes. She dwells with beauty that must die. So take what you can of aesthetic pleasure while she is upset with you. Don't necessarily attend to what she's saying, but feed on her eyes and embrace her hand in yours. This sounds like horrible relationship advice, right? Tune out what your beloved is saying and just take in how gorgeous she is, right? And when she's upset. Yeah. Another response to pain is registered in a romantic way in the sonnet Bright Star, which gave its name to a film about John Keats just a few years ago. In this poem, Bright Star, he argues that one can take heart by looking at the sky, looking at a star, and imagining being like it in an unchanging state, resting on one's lover's chest. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor hung aloft the night. He doesn't want to be alone. And he goes on to detail a number of ways in which he does not want to be like a star before coming back around to the ways in which he does want to be like a star. He writes in line 9, no, yet still like a star, steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft swell and fall, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever, or else swoon to death. Now, obviously, living ever in this bodily form is impossible. What he is imagining is some kind of stasis in which he can capture this romantic moment with his beloved. He goes on in another one of his poems to suggest freezing the moment in an even more formal way, right? He looks at a Grecian urn in which different kinds of ecstasy are caught in a static way forever on the outside of the urn, and imagines, what if I too could partake in this kind of immobility? In Ode on a Grecian Urn, he imagines the beauty of a sound which is caught, and not an oral stimuli that touches these ears, but touches the ears in our imagination, something which could be enjoyed indefinitely because that sound never fades. And in the same way, the beautiful lover that one is chasing is never going to grow old and her beauty fade, right? In Ode on a Grecian Urn, he writes, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth, beneath the trees, thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal, yet do not grieve, she cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss of actually touching her. Forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. So capture the current sensation, the moment, the passion that you feel, and the beauty that you're able to take in, without concerning yourself with its inevitably fading in the future. This obviously is also impossible, right? But it's something that his fancy dallies with, this possibility. And he concludes the poem with the most famous lines from Keats. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. This is the clarion call to aestheticism, that all we can know is the beauty that we take in through our senses, and therefore that is what we should fix our attention on. Now, I'm sure that all of you recognize how troubling this idea is, right? That we are going to focus on the surface level of things, on beauty, which is necessarily going to change, and not anticipate that change, not reconcile oneself to the inevitability of mutability, of change, which affects every aspect of life, right? It's also troubling when Keats, this is one of his earlier poems, he writes on seeing the Elgin marbles, where he delights in seeing these friezes and statues which had been rescued by Lord Elgin from Greece and taken to England, right, for safekeeping. This is a kind of act of imperialistic appropriation, right, of another culture's art. He takes it ostensibly because he wants to protect these things which are lying in decay and which are actually vulnerable to warfare and such things, and put them in a museum in Britain where they'll be safe. This created an international incident soon thereafter, right? There have been people for a couple centuries now who are complaining about the fact that Britain took this great art and has not yet returned it. It still is resting in the British Museum. So Keats is not, he's enjoying the beauty of something, but is not really considering the sociological dimension of it, right? The ways in which it involves cultural appropriation. And, in some of the other ideas that he articulates in his letters, we find other really popular ideas, modernists love these, which I think are troubling. In one of his letters, this is written in December 27, 1818, to his friend Richard Woodhouse, he waxes eloquent about being a chameleon. He calls this being the chameleon poet, about the creative malleability of certain kinds of minds that can inhabit imaginatively different kinds of subject spaces. You can imagine being like a woman over here and a man over here and an animal or a plant or a bug, right? The genius can step into the subject position of all kinds of living things, be they sentient or not. And he goes a little bit further. What shocks the virtuous philosopher delights the chameleon poet. It does no harm from its relish of the dark side of things any more than from its taste for the bright one, because they both end in speculation. A poet is the most unpoetical of anything in existence because he has no identity. He is continually in for and filling some other body. So this is the epitome of flexible identity, right? Being able to enter into all kinds of things imaginatively and identify with them and almost lose your own identity in the process. And in so doing, suspend any kind of moral judgment. He goes on to say in his description of Shakespeare in another letter, he's talking about what's called negative capability. He says that the true artist suspends any kind of moral sensibility that would say this is right, this is wrong. This kind of genius is able to delight in the worst villain in Shakespeare's plays, like Iago, as well as the most virtuous maiden, Imogen, without getting hampered by, held back by any kind of ethical rubric, right? Any kind of moral sensibility that would trip him up. So take everything in and enjoy it equally without thinking of the psychological and sociological and moral dimensions of what you're reading. So I have drawn your attention to some of the limitations of focusing on the sensuous world. It would be wrong to assume that I think that we can ignore it altogether and withdraw into some kind of psychological or spiritual space that neglects the corporeal, that neglects the tangible. Obviously, we need our smell and taste to navigate danger and to draw us towards what is healthy for us. These senses, which we often put on the back burner, are incredibly important. And so is touch, right? If we want to be intimate with someone, if we want to not just navigate danger and pleasure, but if we want to form connections that are meaningful with others, we need to be attuned to our sense of touch, but also their sense of touch, right? This is an incredibly important facet of human existence. If you don't do that, relationships, every dimension of them, are going to falter and fail and fall flat on their face, right? Sorry for all the alliteration there. This goes for sex and every other form of connection. Our hearing, Tracy reminds me, as she was a practicing audiologist for a number of years, hearing is incredibly important for our emotional well-being, right? Without the sound of other people's voice and music, we are likely to suffer a number of different disabilities, particularly if we had that sense and then we lose it, or it's gradually being withdrawn from us. That's going to complicate relationships. I'm not making any kind of comment on the deaf community. I'm talking about those who had hearing and then are losing it. And sight, that is the sense that my students regularly tell me they value the most. Their autonomy is contingent on their ability to see. They want to be independent, as so many of us in the West do. But if we were to focus on that particular sense at the expense of others, we might miss the ways in which it can deceive us. What we think we're seeing is not always what it actually exists. It's often reliable, but not always. If we were to downplay the physical world, we would likely become psychotic in some way, right? And those who have entered into sensory deprivation experiences for short periods of time have described being unmoored from their senses, right? And suggested that this can actually unhinge the way your mind works. It can be incredibly dangerous to do that for too long, like in a sensory deprivation tank or experience. By the same token, different kinds of Gnostic thought, like Manichaeism, which would divorce the material world from the spiritual world and say life is only about the spiritual, that's light, that's brightness, that's good, and everything that's corporeal is tainted and is dangerous and is dark and to be suspected. That would be missing out on a lot of the blessings that come with our mortal bodies, which, as Keats and Shelley and others, Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley and other romantic poets would point out, does fade, but is still valuable. On the flip side, however, if we are determined to pursue pleasure, to take in the sensuous world at all costs, and neglect other aspects of existence, we are essentially living an unexamined life, something which focuses on the surface and refuses to dive beneath it. I want to close by considering the art critic Walter Pater. He's a Victorian art critic, very influential in the late Victorian period, heavily influenced by John Keats, and in turn heavily influences Oscar Wilde and some of the other aesthetes at the end of the 19th century. And he recognizes in what he writes about the Renaissance and towards the preface that we have certain limitations as humans that prevent us from really reading one another's minds, to being as close as we want to be. This is the way he puts it. The whole scope of observation is dwarfed to the narrow chamber of the individual mind. Experience, already reduced to a swarm of impressions, is ringed round for each one of us by that thick wall of personality through which no real voice has ever pierced on its way to us, or from us to that which we can only conjecture to be without. That is, we are incredibly limited when we try to communicate. It doesn't matter how astute we are at reading nonverbal cues, how versatile we are with language. Communication has its limits, and so we are, in a sense, surrounded by a calcified, hardened wall of some kind of substance that prevents us from ever truly touching and knowing another person. It's a rather bleak way of looking at things, and it perhaps enables him to go on later in this essay and make such a daring claim as the following, in which he appears to be preaching a kind of hedonism which is focusing on the immediate, the tangible, and the emotional at the expense of any kind of sociological repercussions. He's not really thinking about how this kind of behavior would affect others, but how it would benefit the self. So this is the sensuous focus up a notch, right? He writes, To burn always with this hard, gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy, is success in life. In a sense, it might even be said that our failure is to form habits, that we shouldn't be forming habits. For after all, habit is relative to a stereotyped world. And then he proceeds, not to discriminate every moment, some passionate attitude in those about us, and in the brilliancy of their gifts, some tragic dividing of forces on their way, is on this short day of frost and sun to sleep before evening. With this sense of the splendor of our experience and of its awful brevity, gathering all we are into one desperate effort to see and touch, we shall hardly have time to make theories about the things we see and touch. What we have to do is to be forever curiously testing new opinions and courting new impressions. So don't stay in one place for too long, so long that you would form ideas or theories or principles about your actions and your experience, but keep on moving, be itinerant, constantly on the move, experiencing new things with new people. That also sounds like very bad relationship advice from my perspective. What Keats and Walter Pater and Oscar Wilde and some others who focus on the sensuous world sometimes miss is the importance of the other layers, which I'm going to be delving into in the entries to follow. I hope you'll stick with me for the experience.